There are empires whose names are etched into the bedrock of history, their banners unfurled for centuries, their rulers immortalized in bronze and marble. And then there are those kingdoms that slip through time like a single breath on a winter morning, visible for only a moment before the air swallows them whole. This is the story of one such place, a realm so fleeting it seemed to bloom with the first thaw of spring and vanish before the frost returned, a kingdom that lasted not a decade, not a year, but a single season. The chroniclers who speak of it, few though they are, write as if describing a dream. They use words like mirage, whisper, and glimmer. Their parchment is filled with the kind of uncertainty that makes historians uneasy. Vague borders, rulers whose names appear in only one account, events described in past tense by authors who lived far away. It is as though the kingdom was less a nation and more a passing shadow that flickered across the earth. Imagine it, the snows have only just melted, turning the rivers into quicksilver veins across a waking land. The fields are still damp, the wind still carries the memory of winter. And yet here in this stretch of contested earth, something stirs, a gathering of people, of voices, of ambition. The tale begins, not in the grand courts of established empires, but on the margins, on the edges of maps where cartographers once wrote terra incognita, unknown land. Here the soil is dark and rich, promising harvests. The hills curve like protective arms around a fertile basin, and somewhere in that sheltered hollow, a decision is made that will change everything to raise a crown. No one agrees entirely on who made the claim. Some say it was a young warlord, barely more than a boy, carrying the bloodline of a deposed dynasty. Others whisper of a woman whose prophetic dreams gave her the loyalty of a scattered people. Still others insist it was neither, that it was a council of elders who simply declared themselves sovereign when no greater power was watching. But whoever it was, they acted quickly, too quickly. In the time it takes other nations to negotiate alliances or build fortifications, this realm seemed to appear fully formed. Traders who had passed through a month prior returned to find banners flying where there had been only farmhouses. Messengers brought tales of a new court, a new set of laws, a new ruler seated on a carved wooden throne. For a brief moment, the air in that valley must have been electric. Farmers planting seed under the protection of newly sworn soldiers, merchants crossing the market square beneath unfamiliar flags, children learning the names of new rulers as though they had always been there. The people must have wondered, perhaps even believed, that this was the start of something enduring, and yet history had other plans. Even in its earliest days, this kingdom's story was threaded with contradictions. A sudden rise meant sudden enemies. Its neighbors, wary and perhaps jealous, watched closely. The skies that spring were unusually warm, but the warmth carried with it the threat of storms, and somewhere, perhaps in the mountains or across the borders, forces were already moving against the fledgling crown. The surviving accounts are frustrating in their incompleteness. One chronicles a coronation festival, filled with music and wine, the crowd cheering in a language now half forgotten. Another, written only weeks later, describes the city as eerily quiet, the gates closed, smoke curling from the palace walls. The gap between these two records is all we have, a silence where an entire kingdom's story should be. That is what makes this tale so compelling, and so haunting. Most kingdoms fade slowly, their decline marked by decades of war or famine. This one seemed to vanish all at once, as if pulled under the surface of history by an unseen hand. One season it stood, the next it was gone, and yet, in the hush of midnight, when the mind wanders and the day's noise has dissolved into stillness, you can almost imagine it still standing. You can picture the main square bathed in lamplight, the sound of distant music carried on the wind, the smell of bread from open-air ovens. You can hear the steady rhythm of the watchman's boots along the walls, for in the span of that single season, life was lived there, and that life left echoes. It is those echoes we will follow tonight. From the first whisper of its rise to the last shadow of its fall, we will trace the story of the kingdom that existed for only one season. We will walk the edges of history, where certainty fades into mystery, where the known dissolves into the unknown, and perhaps by the end we will know whether this was truly a realm lost to time, or a fable crafted to warn us of how quickly even the brightest crowns can tarnish. The story is waiting, the season is about to turn, and somewhere, beyond the reach of certainty, the kingdom still breathes in the quiet corners of the past. The first time I encountered the name of this kingdom, it was in the margins of a brittle manuscript in a provincial archive, not in the main body of the text. No, there it was only mentioned once, in passing, as if the scribe's quill had brushed against it by accident. A single line, crowded between tales of trade disputes and harvest tallies, and in the days of the crown of Lareth, before the first frost, no further explanation. No map, no dates more precise than a vague reference to a season. But there it was, Lareth, the supposed name of this lost realm. Scholars, who have spent their lives combing through the annals of the region, know this moment well. It is the first thread you find when pulling at the fabric of the mystery. And yet, like a thread, it leads into darkness, fraying long before it reaches a clear conclusion. Across the scattered archives of 3 neighboring states, references like this one can be found, never more than a line or two, never in the main chronicles. One speaks of a new sovereign in the southern basin. Another, written in a faded hand, warns of shifting loyalties in the valley of spring markets. And then there are the letters, personal correspondences between minor lords and distant merchants, where Lareth is mentioned as a place worth visiting for its sudden prosperity, though the tone always carries a faint surprise, as if the writer had not expected to find such a court there at all. What is striking is how these mentions seem to cluster around a single year, and then vanish entirely. Before there is nothing, after silence. For the careful historian, this absence is as loud as a trumpet blast. Kingdoms do not simply wink in and out of being, unless of course something extraordinary happens. The trouble is, the archives refuse to agree on what that something was. In one set of records, kept in the stone-walled scriptorium of a coastal monastery, a monk writes that flood and fever came upon the land. He does not name Lareth directly, but the reference to the southern basin matches too neatly to ignore. In another set, a merchant's logbook, preserved in a private collection, the entry for midsummer lists Lareth as a profitable stop along the Silk Route, only for the autumn entry to strike it through in thick ink, replacing it with the words route impassable, no port of call. Even more puzzling are the artifacts. A handful of coins have surfaced in excavations, small, round, and cast in a copper alloy, with a distinctive pattern, a crown flanked by 2 rising suns. No empire of the era used such imagery. The coins bear no ruler's portrait, and the inscriptions are brief to the point of enigma. Just the word Lareth, and what might be a date, though the calendar system is unknown. Numismatists argue endlessly over whether these are genuine relics of the kingdom, or later reproductions meant to cash in on a romantic legend. And then there is the parchment fragment in the capital's royal library, kept locked away, viewable only with permission from the archivist. On it, written in the looping script of an itinerant court scribe, are the words, "The gates newly painted, the air heavy with blossom, the queen's voice carrying over the square." The fragment ends abruptly, torn along one edge. No mention of where the scribe was writing from, but the style suggests he was describing a coronation. The temptation for the modern mind is to imagine these fragments as pieces of a jigsaw puzzle. Surely, if we gather enough of them, the picture will reveal itself. But history is not so generous. Sometimes, no matter how many scraps we find, the puzzle is missing its center. Still, the very lack of a complete record has a strange effect. It draws us closer. It makes us lean in, as if the silence itself is whispering. Archivists who have handled these documents describe an odd sensation. They speak of a feeling not supernatural, but uncanny, that when they read the name Lareth, they are trespassing into a story meant to be forgotten. Perhaps it's because the documents themselves are often marginalia, sidelong glances from other narratives, never the main subject. It's as though history itself refuses to look Lareth in the eye. And then inevitably, the human imagination begins to fill the gaps. The missing lines become feasts for speculation. Was the kingdom destroyed so completely that no one dared record its end? Or was it deliberately erased, its memory scrubbed clean by victors who found it convenient for the world to forget? There is one tantalizing clue in the imperial registry of a northern neighbor. In the year that matches the coin inscriptions, there is a notation in the tax ledgers: shipment from basin postponed, no collection due. The entry is underlined, as if to draw attention. Next to it, in the margin, someone has written, "The season is over." Was this a literal note about the harvest season, or a metaphor for the life of the kingdom itself? The ambiguity is maddening and irresistible. The archival trail ends as suddenly as it begins. After that year, Lareth is gone from every record, as if it had never been there. The maps of the time, many of which have survived, make no mention of it. Later chroniclers, even those meticulous about listing obscure villages and defunct duchies, pass over the name entirely. Yet in that gap, in that space where something should be, the mind begins to hear it. The faintest echo, like the last note of a song fading in an empty hall. It is in this echo that the search begins. For if we are to understand how a kingdom could exist for only one season, we must first understand the land it came from, the people who might have built it, and the strange convergence of forces that allowed it to flare so briefly and vanish so completely. And so we turn from the dust of the archives, to the soil of the land itself, to the valley that once held the heart of Lareth. There, perhaps, the silence will speak more clearly. Long before the name Lareth ever appeared in the archives, the valley was known simply as the Basin. It was a place that sat between worlds, a shallow bowl of fertile land, cradled by hills to the north, and low mountains to the south, its rivers spilling east toward the sea. Travelers described it as a place of strange duality. In spring, it was a paradise, the riverbanks lush with new growth, the air heavy with the perfume of wild plum blossoms, and the fields soft underfoot with dark, rich soil. But in winter, the same basin could feel like a prison. The fog rolled in thick and cold from the mountains, and the narrow passes froze shut, cutting the land off from the outside world for weeks at a time. This rhythm, abundance and isolation, shaped the lives of the people who lived there. They were neither entirely part of the coastal kingdoms, nor wholly tied to the inland empires. Instead, they existed in a liminal state, their loyalties shifting with the seasons and the trade winds. For centuries, the basin was not a single political unit, but a patchwork. Small farming hamlets clung to the riverbanks. Hill forts, their walls made of earth and timber, kept watch over the few passable roads. A handful of market towns thrived briefly when trade was good, then faded back into obscurity when merchants took other routes. No single power ever managed to hold the basin for long. Its location made it too valuable to ignore, yet too hard to defend against determined rivals, and yet, it had its allure. The land itself was generous in the years when the weather favored it. Barley and flax grew in the low fields, while orchards of cherry and pear dotted the hillsides. Herds of sheep and goats grazed in the uplands, producing wool prized by distant markets. Its rivers, swift and cold, were rich with trout, and the wetlands at the southern edge offered wildfowl in abundance. But the basin's true value lay in its position. It was a crossroads, the meeting point of two ancient trade routes, one running east to west, linking the inland kingdoms to the ports, and another running north to south, carrying goods from the high mountain passes down to the coastal plains. In peaceful times, this made the basin a hub of commerce. In troubled times, it made it a prize to be fought over. The cultures that brushed against the basin left their mark like overlapping fingerprints. From the north came the stone-carving traditions and long ballads of the highland clans. From the east came intricate pottery styles and a taste for spiced wine. From the south, caravans brought fabrics dyed in deep, impossible blues and religious icons cast in bronze. Even the language of the basin's people was a blend, peppered with words from 3 different tongues, each syllable a reminder that no border here was ever permanent. But this cultural richness came with instability. Without a central authority, disputes were settled by custom, by barter, or when necessary, by the sword. Neighboring lords, some just days' ride away, saw the basin's towns as easy prey for raids. Every generation had its share of burned farmsteads and displaced families. Perhaps it was this instability that left the basin ripe for a sudden unification. The people, weary of shifting allegiances and unpredictable rulers, might have been ready, eager even for a single power to bring order. There were also larger forces at play. In the years before Lareth's brief rise, the great empire to the west was in decline, its grip on its frontier territories loosening. The northern clans, long feared for their raids, had turned inward, embroiled in their own succession disputes, and in the coastal kingdoms to the east, a series of harsh winters had driven many to seek trade and opportunity farther inland. All of these pressures pushed people toward the basin, merchants looking for safer routes, farmers searching for unclaimed land, and ambitious leaders hungry for a power vacuum to fill. The land itself seemed to conspire in this convergence. The winter before the season of Lareth was unusually mild, the snow melted early, and the rivers swelled with meltwater, feeding the fields before the spring planting. The roads through the passes opened weeks ahead of schedule, allowing traders and travelers to flow in before rival powers could reassert their control. It was as if the basin was inviting the world in, shaking off its isolation just long enough for something unexpected to happen. We can picture it, a caravan from the coast rolling in under pale spring skies, their carts heavy with bolts of cloth and casks of wine, farmers leading teams of oxen into fields already warming under the sun, local elders meeting in the market square to discuss rumors of a charismatic figure who had begun speaking of unity, a kingdom that could stand on its own, answer to no foreign lord, and hold its borders for more than a single harvest. It is here in this moment of quiet abundance and fragile peace, that the seed of the kingdom was planted. The basin for once was not under siege, the outside powers were distracted, the land was generous, and the people, perhaps without even realizing it, were ready to crown someone. The question that remains, of course, is why it all happened so quickly. Why in a place that had resisted unification for centuries, did a crown suddenly appear? The answer lies not just in the land and its people, but in the person who seized the moment, and so as the valley warms under that fateful spring sun, we turn our gaze toward the figure at the center of it all, the one who dared to gather the basin's scattered threads into a single banner. The first time the would-be ruler spoke, it was not in a hall of stone, nor before a council of lords. It was in the open air, at the edge of the market square, where carts creaked and hawkers sang, where the valley's many tongues tangled and untangled in the same breath. The last chill of winter still clung to the morning, but the sun was already lifting the mist off the river, like a curtain from a stage. Some remember a young man with a scar along his jaw, the mark of a border skirmish that never made the annals. Others insist it was a woman in a traveller's cloak, hair braided with bright ribbon like the Highland clans, voice low and unhurried, and a few, stubborn in their certainty, say it was neither, only a small council of elders, speaking through a single herald with a reed-smooth voice. Historians squint at these contradictions, looking for a portrait to fix to a name. But for one brief season, what mattered was not the face, it was the promise. The words were plain: no more seasons borrowed from other crowns, no more tithes to a lord who never walks our fields, no more maps that forget us. Plain words, spoken without flourish, yet the effect was almost tangible. People paused mid-bargain. A boy with a bundle of kindling set it down, and did not remember to pick it up again. The tinker held a brass buckle, and forgot to haggle. Even the geese in a wicker pen went strangely quiet, as if listening for the ending of something, and the beginning of something else. Promises are wind, unless they find purchase, and this one did, quickly, almost shockingly so. Within a week, messengers had gone to the hill forts and the river towns. Within a month, Return envoys arrived at dawn, their horses dark with sweat, bearing tokens of ascent. A carved spindle from the weaver's guild, a handful of river glass from the ferryman, a fragment of banner from a fort that had once flown the colors of a distant lord. Each token said what the valley had seldom said in unison. Yes, the leader, whoever they were by name or by counsel, moved with a speed that belied the valley's history of hesitation. Oaths were taken not in secret chambers, but in the square, under a sky that could not be bribed. The new laws, if they could be called laws, fit on a single strip of vellum. No tithe to foreign lords this season. Every trade sworn to keep the roads open. Every farm given a soldier for the planting, and a soldier for the harvest. Every dispute judged by the elder who knows the field, not the stranger who knows the law. It was radical, not for its harshness, but for its simplicity. The people understood it at a glance, and understanding is a bridge to loyalty. There were symbols too. There are always symbols. Someone stamped the first copper coins in a smithy that had once cast horseshoes and hinges. They were small, and not quite round. You could feel the uneven edge against your skin. On one face a crown, on the other, two rising suns. The coin turned in the light like a promise turning into proof. The two suns were strange to outsiders, but clear to those who lived here morning and evening, spring and autumn, the basin's life defined by seasons and thresholds. A crown between them meant sovereignty, held in the brief perfect balance. Banners appeared in ways that made you suspect they had been waiting, folded for this exact moment. Cloth dyed in vegetable blue and river green, unfurled from the town hall, then from the watchtower, then from the ferry post, where a boy with ink on his fingers wrote the day's crossings. On market day, scarves and ribbons in the same colors fluttered from women's hair and men's wrists, as if the whole valley had agreed, in a single sleep and a single waking, to become one thing. And yet, beneath this surge of unity, there was careful work, the quiet carpentry of a kingdom assembling itself. The ferrymen at the southern wetland were given timber and iron nails, and asked to rebuild the floating docks. In the north, a vexing bend in the road that had snapped axles for years was straightened by a chain of farmers with spades, each rewarded with seed grain stamped with the new seal. At the mountain passes, a wooden gate was erected, not to shut out trade, but to measure it, to count it, to name it. When merchants asked what fees were due, the steward replied with something no one had heard in living memory: fewer than before. Even the smallest adjustments became a kind of ceremony. The market bell, long cracked, was rehung. The watch schedule, once dictated by whoever shouted the loudest, was written out and posted where even a boy could read it with his thumb. A scribe, the same itinerant hand we glimpsed in that fragment, set up a table near the well, and wrote receipts for goods that had never known such paperwork. Paperwork is not poetry, but in a world where theft is a policy and taxes vanish into distance, a receipt can feel like a hymn. If this sounds too easy, like a dream moving on greased wheels, the doubt is warranted. What we have are accounts that compress weeks into pages and pages into lines. Somewhere in those lines there must have been quarrels, a hill fort that refused to lower its old colors, a clan that would not trade sheep without a promise about grazing rights carved in oak, a merchant who demanded coastal protection that the newborn crown could not guarantee. The miracle is not that these frictions existed, the miracle is how briefly they mattered. The coronation, if that is the right word, arrived as simply as the laws. There was no cathedral, there was a platform. No golden orb, there was a wooden bowl of river water and a crown hammered in a week by a smith with clever hands and sleepless eyes. The crowd pressed so close that the dais felt like a raft. The elder from the eastern orchard spoke first, voice papery but steady. "We have planted under other flags, let us harvest under our own." Then the leader stepped forward, the reed-smooth herald, or the scar-jawed youth, or the woman with ribbons like rivers. History does not choose for us. What it remembers is the light, the way it fell through a bank of high cloud and turned the bronze crown into something briefly alive. What it remembers is the sound, the hush that precedes a vow, and the vow that does not need embellishment. By our fields, by our roads, by our dead, I will keep this valley whole. A basin of river water, cold, sweet, slightly mineral, the taste of stone, was poured over the crown and then over the ruler's hands. The water ran down and darkened the boards underfoot like a shadow suddenly deepened, and a murmur passed through the crowd that was not quite cheer and not quite prayer, something in between, which is where new nations are born. From that moment, the pace quickened. Messengers set out like sparks blown from a fire to the inland empires, to the west, carrying a polite letter that said nothing unwise and everything necessary, to the coastal kingdoms, bearing samples of cloth and wool, and a promise of low tariffs before anyone could ask for them, to the highland clans with casks of spiced mead, and a personal invitation to the midsummer fair. The letters were stamped with the 2 suns and a wax seal that cooled almost too fast in the brisk air, a small reminder that speed and fragility were sisters in this endeavor. At the same time, the walls were mended, not to keep anyone in, but to give the towns sleep, the gift of unbroken hours. The fields were sown with uncommon coordination, teams of soldiers trading spear for plow handle in the hours before noon and spear again by dusk. There is an account of a captain who knew the names of the orchards like children, who walked the rows and marked the blight the way a doctor marks a fever, and then requisitioned ash and salt from the keep, as if ordering bolts for a ballista. In other seasons, this would have been an anecdote. In this season, it was policy. And then there were the festivals, because a kingdom that is only defended and never celebrated does not grow roots. The first festival was improvised. A fiddler stood on an overturned barrel by the granary and bowed something fast, while a baker gave out bread he swore had risen higher under the new banners. Dancers circled until dust rose from the square like smoke, and someone cried, "The summer," though it was barely spring, and the cry stuck, and the festival was named before it was planned. For one evening, even the serious men who counted ledgers tapped their toes. Not all were charmed. At the edge of the light, a merchant from the coast whispered that tariffs once lowered are nails that rust. A priest, wary of crowns that rise without blessing, fingered his beads and kept silent through the dancing. A boy, eyes narrow, drew the 2 suns in the dirt, and then scuffed them out with his heel, as children do when they are afraid of hoping too much. The neighboring powers took notice, of course. Riders watched from the ridgeline, without dismounting their horses, stamping in rhythm with the music below. A courier from the west arrived with a letter written in a hand so precise it might have been carved. "We acknowledge your governance for the present season, contingent upon peace." The phrase "for the present season" is a masterpiece of condescension and caution, and it tells us what the neighbors believed, that the valley's unity would melt like the last snow. But the valley did not melt, it set. Laws hardened, roads smooth. A census, a word that had never carried much weight here, was spoken aloud in the square by a scribe, counting not just heads, but trades, orchards, boats and grain stores. Numbers, once tools of outsiders, became a mirror the valley held up to itself. Couples were wed under the new banners, and children born and named with a calendar that began this spring, not someone else's year. It is fashionable among scholars to say that states are contracts. For a season, Lerith felt like a vow. Still, in the folds of the vow, shadows pooled. The mild winter that had opened the passes had also left the mountains with less snow. The rivers ran high in spring, but there were mutters among millers about what summer would do. A caravan arrived late, complaining of rock slides where the road had never slidden before, and a healer in the southern wetland sent a note north about a fever that made men drowsy and left them tasting iron. A small noise in a busy season, easy to file among the day's many papers. There were political shadows too. A petty lord to the east, whose stipend relied on valley tides, wrote 3 letters in 1 week, growing colder in each. A highland clan, drawn but not yet committed, asked for grazing rights that would wound a dozen small farms if granted, and wound a friendship if refused. The new crown could not please both the past and the future, and so began the first balancing acts. The fine art of saying not now in a tone that did not sound like never. Even as these threads tightened, the city, if it could be called that, found its rhythm. Morning bell, market noise, the steady thunk of a carpenter's mallet, the evening watch changing under a sky that kept forgetting to be cold. The crown moved quietly through this, not on a litter, but on foot, a habit that infuriated those who feared for the ruler's life, and endeared them to those whose lives the ruler brushed a hand on a shoulder, a question about a field, a pause to hear a complaint in full, rather than in summary. Such small gestures do not make a nation, but they make the rumor of one, and rumor travels faster than any decree. By mid-spring, the valley wore its new name as if it had been stitched there long ago, Lerith. It sounded like river water over small stones, like a half-remembered song. The word lifted when spoken, as if refusing to be pinned to one mouth or one face. A traveling poet pressed it into a verse that children shouted as they ran, and the verse outpaced the poet, as verses will. The coronation platform became a reviewing stand for wagons laden with grain. The cracked bell rang clear after its mending and unexpectedly struck a pitch that harmonized with the cliffs beyond the river, so that on certain evenings the valley seemed to sing with its own sound. To an outsider, this may read like fancy. To those who lived it, it felt like the land had accepted the bargain made in the square, and so the season opened wider. The roads were safest in memory. Trade was brisk, prices fair, letters traveled and returned with cautious blessings. The council, whether of one voice or several, learned the difficult pleasure of sleeping without reaching for a weapon at every noise. The crown, it was said, spent an hour each dawn on the walls, not as a ruler surveying dominion, but as a person watching light change stone into gold, and then back again. Perhaps they were counting the days, perhaps they were stealing them. History, when it wants to be merciful, grants a moment of undisturbed glow before the hinge turns. Lerith had such a moment. It felt like the world held its breath, not out of fear, but out of gratitude, that something so improbable had for once come true in the open. What follows? The festivals, the embassies, the trade that thrummed like a heartbeat, belongs to summer. The crown would be cheered in streets strung with garlands. The river would shine like polished metal, and children would grow a handspan taller under the quiet of guarded nights. For now we leave the crown on the wall at dawn, the two suns stamped on coin and banner both, and the valley warm with the belief that what begins well must go on. Summer did not arrive all at once. It drew near like a melody you recognize before you can name it. The mornings lengthened. The river slowed and widened, sunlight swimming in it like coins. Wheat lifted its heads and whispered together when the wind passed. Larith, a name still new enough to feel like a promise when spoken aloud, entered its season of radiance. The first great market was held on a day the almanac called Second Sun, when the hills blush and the orchard shade is thick enough for sleep. Stalls multiplied like birds on a line, spice sellers from the coast with their little painted boxes, glassmakers whose wares seemed to hold rain, highland weavers, unrolling cloth that kept its own weather in the pattern. The air was perfumed with honey cakes, and smoke, and crushed mint. Above, banners with the twin seal caught and released the light, a slow fluttering heartbeat for the whole square. Envoys came too, discreet at first, a factor from the Western Empire, wearing humility like a second robe, a diplomat from the coastal cities, who smiled without showing teeth. They moved through the market with professional unhurriedness, noting prices, counting soldiers under their breath, asking questions to which they already knew the answers. At evening, they stood on the wall beside the crown and spoke sentences that had been drafted in distant rooms. Acknowledgements, not recognitions, friendship, not alliance, peace for this season, not a day longer. Still their very presence felt like a kind of bow. If the crown was wary, it did not show. The ruler walked the length of the new docks, fingers skimming the fresh timbers as if reading a page. They paused with fishermen who had learned the currents long before Larith had a name, drew lines on a map where sandbars shifted, and signed off on a small lighthouse, a stack of stone lamplit by a rota of boys at dusk. Modest in the scale of empires, it was extravagant for a town that months earlier had barely kept its roads from washing away. Extravagant, and right. The river mouth glowed steady at night, and barges moored without fear. Prosperity shows itself first in small kindness, Bakers added an extra heel of bread to the poor man's measure. The midwife carried little bundles of lavender to the women she visited. A carpenter finally mended the shutter he had told his wife he'd get to when the war stopped, and when no war came, he did it quietly, ashamed. Laughter returned to places that had forgotten it, not as uproar, but as a soft remainder in the air. The midsummer fair crowned it. Lanterns were strung from eave to eave, simple spheres of oiled paper that turned the streets into a procession of moons. Music swelled and thinned and swelled again. A pipe like birds, a fiddle like running water, a drum like someone knocking on the door of your heart from inside. The crown wove through each pause, a conversation, a question about grain storage, a promise to send the steward to settle a boundary, a blessing for a child with solemn eyes. Blessings, even from human hands, carry weight in a season like this. On the wall, a foreign rider, thinking himself unseen, counted the watch. One squad, then the relief, then the pair that walked the parapet as if they were strolling their own gardens. To a soldier's eye, Larith's peace looked organized, and organized peace is always unnerving to those accustomed to profiting from disorder. Letters went out that night from the envoy's quarters, ink drying under the breath of a travel candle. Continue observations, trade brisk, levy low, people satisfied. Trade, that barometer of the mood, surged. Flax thread gleamed on spindles at twilight. The wool guild kept careful books and smiled at their totals like men holding warm stones. The ferrymen, once kings of a narrow strip of river, now wore the crown's badge and joked that they had become courtiers with poles. Even the potter, with the reputation for temper, sat in his doorway in the long heat and hummed to himself, eyes on a bowl drying like a pale moon. And yet, because a season of glory is never only light, omens sidled in, not as omens, but as practical notices. The millers complained that the river, while gentle, was lower than it should be by this date. Water, like trust, is healthiest when it has momentum. The sawyer, who sourced timbers from the mountain road, arrived late with his cart and said the path had slipped in 2 places. Nothing grave, but odd given the mild winter. The hill moves as if it is bored, he said, and laughed and spit and asked for more nails. There were rumors too, shaped like everyday talk, so that they could pass easily from mouth to mouth. The Highland clans, some said, were less divided than they looked, and were testing Larith's promises for weakness. The coastal city that had sent the smiling diplomat had also sent an accountant, who asked for numbers twice. A peddler claimed a village beyond the southern wetlands had shut its gates at noon because of sleeping fever, and someone else said he had misheard, and it was only a summer malaise. Too much sun, not enough water. The crown listened. That alone set this season apart from others, and did not forbid fear, only organized it. A small council met at dawn, when the light was clean. They moved weights around on a board, to represent grain and men sacks and spears, and made decisions that were not dramatic enough to be sung about, which is to say, they were exactly right for a kingdom. Send 2 engineers to the mountain road with planks and rope, write to the Highland chiefs again, and offer grazing on the North Commons. Cut a sluice near the mill to keep the wheel turning. If the river drops, dispatch a healer to the southern villages, with herbs and advice, and a smile, because a smile can be medicine when medicine runs thin. Meanwhile, the city, if city is the word we will allow ourselves, learned the choreography of confidence. The bell signaled the opening of the day, as if it had always done so, perhaps secretly it had even when cracked. Bread was set out on tables, with the good crust facing the street. Young men wore ribbons of blue and green that bleached to soft versions of themselves by noon. In the shade, the elders played at game boards with little pieces of bone, pretending not to notice that children had come to watch them. This is how instruction happens in peacetime. Letters arrived from far places, with compliments wrapped in cautions. The Western Empire sent a gift of olives preserved in amphorae, and a phrase too carefully chosen, mutual advantage. The coastal cities proposed a treaty to standardize weights along the river, an honest improvement dressed in the garments of oversight. Larith answered each with courtesy that did not try to be clever. The crown's seal, 2 suns, stamped the wax, and on some nights, when the wind shifted, you could smell the wax warming as the letters were pressed, a little scent of bees and heat and purpose. There were weddings, of course there were. Love discovers its courage when the future looks like a place you can walk toward with someone's hand in yours. The baker's daughter married the miller's second son. The weaver pledged himself to the merchant's niece, who had learned her figures on the back of bills and would keep the books neat as a garden. A soldier bowed his head under a garland and tried not to weep as his mother kissed his cheeks. The crown attended these not as sovereign, but as witness, and it is possible, just possible, that this is the closest thing to a miracle any ruler can offer, to stand near vows and bless them with presence rather than decree. The fair ended. The week began. Another fair gathered. The rhythm held. If you went to the wall at twilight and listened, you would hear a sound like breath, in, out, the city settling itself. And if you squinted just right, the lanterns that marked the main way seemed to tilt toward the gate, as if directing fortune how to enter. Then a dry wind came. Not cruel, not desert-born, just inattentive. It lifted dust where grass should have been, and made the leaves on the poplar turn their pale sides outward, as if they were reading the sky for news. The miller reduced the sluice another notch, and told his boy to stop the wheel at noon to cool the greased axle. The healer returned from the southern villages with a measured report, a fever that took 1 in 20 to bed for 3 days, a metallic taste, a reluctance to wake at first light. It is nothing, she said, which in a summer of glory meant, it is something we can bear. The Highland chiefs came at last, tall and quiet, their cloaks smelling of wool and wind. They stood with the crown beneath the lintel of the hall, where heat collects in a way that makes speech deliberate. After hours, they stepped back into sunlight with an agreement not written on parchment, but carved into a staff, symbols of grazing and water, the curve of a path, a circle for festival days shared. The carver's knife clucked softly, as if approving. The staff was held high, and the crowd sighed in that way crowds do when they have been holding their breath without telling themselves they were. At the docks, barges heavier than any in memory tied up with ropes that sang under strain, barley for the sea, salt for the valley, a crate of books, books for the scribe who had taught letters to boys on market days and now found himself with a bench of students whose fathers had not thought such things necessary until a crown made of bronze and river water had suggested the future might be negotiable. Evenings stretched. Children chased their shadows until the shadows chased them back. Dogs slept in doorways, like rolled rugs. The crown, this detail appears in 3 different accounts, and so we keep it. Took to walking alone at dusk, along the river path, where the lamps were spaced far apart, perhaps to think, perhaps to listen, perhaps to measure something, only they could feel, the way a season, no matter how generous, begins to lean. The way even joy grows roots that can be tugged, and always, at the periphery, the watchers. On the ridge, a small fire, where silhouettes moved carefully so as not to reveal numbers. On the road from the east, traders who asked casually whether Larith's levy would remain as merciful when autumn required soldiers to guard the gleanings. In the square, a stranger with nails too clean for a caravan man, who nonetheless told a very good joke about a sheep and a bishop. Laughter is intelligence's favorite disguise. Summer bent toward its height. Grain took on that silvery stagecraft, just before goal. The first apples were a rumor in the mouth. The bell rang a little slower, as if to say, we are in the fat middle of the day of the year, and Larith, wearing a crown that still surprised it, smiled, the tired, satisfied smile of a people who had worked and danced and believed. The omens, if we must use the word, stopped pretending. A night wind broke a rack of lanterns in the square, with a sound like sudden applause. A messenger from the west, pale and hoarse, brought news of a border retaken by an empire that had seemed distracted. A letter on heavy paper from the coastal cities recommended a seasonal adjustment to tariffs that was arithmetic for obedience. And from the southern wetlands, a boatman arrived with eyes as if he had stared too long at the sun, and said simply, "The water is stale." The crown assembled the council and placed beside the weights for grain and men a smooth river stone. This, the ruler said, is our season. It fits the hand. It is beautiful. It can also be thrown or lost. No one spoke for a time. When they did, their voices had shed the easy summer late. Plans were made that tasted of iron. Inventories in triplicate, the quiet recall of 2 cohorts from the road project, a letter to the coastal cities, requesting a meeting on neutral ground, discreet inquiries about the fever's reach, a gift of salt and song to the Highland chiefs, because friendship kept warm does not cool so easily. Outside, the city slept the sleep of fields after rain, though it had not rained. Dreams came, sweet, and then at their edges, thin. A dog lifted its head, and growled at nothing. Somewhere, a shutter knocked. A lover woke, and did not know why. Morning brought brightness so clean it hurt. Market opened, and business went on, because that is what people do. They are the most courageous when they are most ordinary. The potter's bowl, the baker's loaf, the ferryman's pole, biting water, all continued. But the listener, attuned to subtlety, could hear an undertone like a second bell, far away, telling a different hour. Lareth had been given a summer, and it had filled it as fully as human hands can fill a measure. It had gathered grain and laughter and law. It had taught itself to walk like a kingdom, and to bless like a neighbor. It had been glorious, not as empires are glorious, with armies, but as gardens are, orderly, generous, briefly perfect. And then the wind shifted. The light came at a new angle. The apples blushed all at once, as if embarrassed by their own ripeness. There is a day in every season when the air advises change. It is not unkind. It is simply honest. On that day, the crown stood at the wall again, looking toward the passes that had opened so early, and now seemed farther away than maps allowed. Below, the city moved with practiced grace. Above, a hawk circled, reading sentences no human eye could decipher. The ruler touched the stone, kept in the pocket, the one smooth as an answer, and slippery as a half-truth. Storms rarely announce themselves with thunder. They begin with small disobediences. A wheel that squeals in a mill that was silent yesterday. A ledger total that is a whisper shorter than last week. A cough that lingers half a day longer than it should, in a house that keeps its windows open. In Lareth, the summer had been generous, but generosity, taken to its edge, starts to bend. The bend is where the trouble begins. First came the water, not its absence exactly. The river still ran, and the docks still clinked with mooring irons, but its temperament changed. The miller, who had known its moods since he was a boy, could not make it listen. The current thinned at noon, and came back with an odd, lazy vigor by evening, as if the mountain snowmelt had become a late riser. It sulks, he told the crown's steward, embarrassed to speak of a river, as if it were a child. The steward, not embarrassed at all, wrote, flow irregular, consult engineers, cut auxiliary sluice. Practical words, sound policy. But where waters wander, numbers wobble, and where numbers wobble, promises do too. Then the road. The sawyer's cart returned with fresh splinters, and a tale about stones shifting under hooves, like sleeping beasts. A bend in the pass, long reliable, had slumped. No catastrophe, just a slow conceding of earth to gravity's patience. The repair crew, the crown sent, found the surface powder dry beneath its crust, a surprise after a mild winter. They shored it with planks and rope, and sang loudly to keep fear out of the joins. The song worked for a week. In the southern wetlands, the healer catalogued a pattern she did not like. The fever that had been a brief inconvenience became a habit in certain villages. Most recovered, 3 days, a taste like metal, a reluctance to wake, but the rhythm bothered her. Illnesses, like songs, should resolve. This one looped. It took the oldest quickly, and the strongest slowly, which is a cruel proportion. She returned with a pouch of herbs, and a brow the color of thought, and she told the council gently that the sickness was not nothing. The council answered with supplies and appointments, and a firm compassion. They did what they could. It was not the wrong thing. It was simply not enough to be decisive. Meanwhile, the ledger changed its voice. The wool guild's profit line still rose but flatter, as if the pen had grown tired. The ferryman reported more crossings, but fewer paying full rate, a fact they disguised in jokes about friendly discounts for the anxious. The grain merchants, who had smiled all through Second Sun, asked practical questions about autumn storage. They spoke softly, as one does in a library, because harvest talk is holy. The steward's board, with its weights for grain and men, became crowded. Each weight is small until it is set beside another, and another, then even the table creaks. Politics heard the creak, and tapped it with a finger like a testing knuckle. The coastal cities, all lacquer and ledgers, sent a new letter. In light of seasonal variabilities, we recommend an adjustment to river levies, to stabilize exchange. The words were spotless, the meaning had dirt under its nails. Raise your tariffs, they said, and we will call it stability. The Western Empire, slow and careful, reclaimed a border town that had not mattered for years until it suddenly did, and then wrote to Larith, with the kind of congratulation that is a folded map of intention. The Highland chiefs kept their carved agreement staff visible at every meeting, which is the tribal version of a smile with all the teeth showing. Inside the walls, small tempers flared where there had been none. The potter, who had hummed in June, threw a bowl against the kiln door in late July, and cursed the clay for being too wet and too dry in the same breath. The baker scolded his apprentice for pulling loaves early, a mistake the boy swore he had not made. Lovers quarreled about nothing, then apologized with a severity out of proportion to the quarrel. Wariness stole the corners of patience. The city still laughed, but its laughter broke sooner. The crown kept walking the dusk path by the river, as if listening for a cadence that would tell them which instrument in the orchestra was out of tune. One evening, a child followed at a distance, a girl with a braid heavy as rope. When the ruler stopped, she stopped. When the ruler looked up at a hawk circling, she did too. The ruler turned, then not surprised, and asked, "What do you hear?" The girl, serious in the honest way some children are said, replied, "The river sounds like someone thinking." The ruler smiled without mirth. "Yes," they said, "and thinking is slow." The council met earlier, when the day was still cool. They spread their problems like maps, and looked for the roads between them. The healer argued for more herbs and more rest hours for the caregivers, because exhausted hands are clumsy. The miller asked for men to dig the auxiliary channel wider, to bank against the river's moods. The sawyer wanted temporary shutters on the mountain road, one-way travel by hour, so that repairs could hold. The merchants wanted clarity above all, better to know a levy will rise, than to fear it might. The crown listened and gave what could be given without spending the season's soul. No tariffs, they said, not while the harvest promise is still a promise. It was a brave sentence. Brave sentences grow heavy when they must be carried for long. Rumor, which had been dressed in market clothes, changed into armor. It said, as rumors do, that the Western Empire had a cousin with a claim on an old grant that overlapped the basin's northern ridge. It said that a coastal magnate had hired soldiers and called them accountants because their helmets were shiny. It said that the fever in the southern wetlands was a curse from a temple that disliked new crowns. Rumor is stupid as a single line and brilliant as a web. The crown ordered a census of fear, which is to say a discreet sweep of taverns, ferry quays, and bakehouse lines. The report came back with too many herds and not enough saws. Uncertainty is a country without roads. On an afternoon clogged with heat, a caravan from the east arrived, wind-blown and thin. Their leader, a woman with a scarf the color of pomegranates, asked for water first, and then told a story while her horses drank. The passes, she said, have teeth this year. Rock where there was path where there was rock, a trickle of stones in the night, like beads from a broken string. We followed our usual song, she said, and the mountain sang back a different tune. The council noted it as meteorology. The guard captain, who had seen broken strings before, noted it as omen. None of this, not the water, not the road, not the fever, not the letters, not the rumors, constituted a storm. Each could be mended, managed, smoothed. Lerith had built its brief power on practicalities. The city had grown skilled at the alchemy of not yet and just enough. But in the spaces between the practicalities, something else developed, a thinness. The sense of a fabric, stretched across a frame, handsome and taut, beginning to show where the threads did not quite cross. A quarrel at the docks made the thinness audible. Two bargemen shouted about priority. One shoved, the other fell hard enough to bite his tongue. Blood has a way of being more than itself in public. It is theatre, even when nobody wants a play. The watch waded in, good at their work, and the steward arrived with the calm of a book. Fines were levied, apologies formalized, a handshake required. It ended well, as incidents go, and yet the people who watched drifted home with their mouths set differently. The market felt cool at the edges for an hour. Sometimes peace survives, because it is very well trained. Sometimes it survives, because it has not yet been surprised. The surprise came small. A courier from the western border did not arrive. His absence was a blank that swallowed words around it. The following day, his horse returned with no rider, and a bridle that smelled of sage and iron. The captain of the watch brushed the horse's neck, and said nothing. The council said nothing. The crown said, "We will not be the first to speak fear aloud." They smiled when they said it. So the sentence warmed, but the words themselves were carved. Night fell clean, and then felt wrong. The lanterns on the main way shivered in a breeze that no one felt on their skin. A door slammed in a district where doors did not slam. The bell rang the hour, and then this is in 3 accounts as well, rang a half-struck note, as if it had changed its mind mid-sound. The city listened to the space after the bell, that little pocket of silence that always follows striking. In that pocket, you could imagine you heard distant hoofs. You could imagine many things. Imagination is a good citizen in summer, and a poor one when storms are near. Morning brought errands with edges. The crown signed orders for more grain sacks, more rope, more lamp oil. They read a letter from the coastal cities, suggesting an autumn summit in a place notorious for ambushes, and said politely, no. They wrote to the Highland chiefs, and put a line in the letter that was not about grazing or water, but about daughters married to sons, and sons sworn to daughters, reminding everyone that kinship is stronger than ink. They stood on the wall at noon, and watched the river deciding itself. They put a hand to the stone in their pocket, and found it warmer than the day warranted. Inside the hall, the steward moved weights on the board with a precision that bordered on tenderness. He knew each one by the sound it made on the wood grain, a soft clack, men, a firmer kiss, horses, a thud like a tired heart, lamp oil, a domestic tap. He arranged them into a pattern that would hold if nothing else changed. Something else always changes. Afternoon thunderheads massed far away, then drifted apart, as if persuaded by some higher etiquette not to make a scene. A hawk drew circles smaller than last week. A boy lost his kite to a trick of wind and cried about it in a way that made everyone near him avert their eyes. The healer tied back her hair and counted her bundles. The miller loosened the sluice another notch. The ferryman noted without complaint that people had started to ask about his pole's length, as if his reach were a measure of their safety. When the first leaf fell, it did so in full green, a single impulse from a tree that was not otherwise ready. It landed on the crown's shoulder as they walked. They took it between finger and thumb, and considered the line of its veins. Too early, they said, and smiled again, and did not force a meaning. Nature does not care for our foreshadowing. It insists on its own, and still in the rooms where quiet is policy, the word collapse did not appear. The council spoke of adjustments and contingencies and reserves. They were not wrong, they were only mortal. The seeds of the storm had been sown by rivers and roads, by coughs and letters, by pride and prudence both. They lay underfoot like grains on a threshing floor, invisible until the flail comes down. At dusk the crown stood once more on the wall. Below, the city made its decent sounds, cutlery singing a baby's persuasive complaint, the slow slap of rope against dock post. Beyond, the passes held their neat blue distance. A swallow skimmed the air, and wrote a line no scribe can copy. The ruler set the green leaf on the parapet, and pressed it flat. Hold, they said, the same quiet command as before. Hold and prepare. Night answered with an old language, the creak of cart axles, the click of a latch, a dog's bark, a shout cut off mid-word. then stillness, then the long sound of air moving where air should not. The storm had not broken, but its first syllables had. In the morning, the city would wake to news that no steward's weights could balance. The season would tip, and Lareth, which had learned to be glorious, would learn how quickly glory can be asked to pay its debts. The first report arrived at dawn. When the sky was the color of tin, a watchman on the western road saw a dust plume where no caravan should be, and rang the small bell reserved for irregular news, not alarm, information. The bell's modest clang crossed roofs and alleys, a polite knock on the city's attention. Men and women turned their heads. The crown came to the wall, bareheaded, the green leaf from the night before still pressed under a palm. The dust separated into horses, and the horses into riders, and the riders into something that was not quite an army, and not quite a procession. They carried spears at a rest that could tilt to war in a breath. Banners with unfamiliar devices, a hand, a sunburst, a knot, lifted and fell in the morning wind, like problems rehearsing their entrances. When the riders were close enough to see their faces, the captain of the watch exhaled through his teeth. Mercenaries, the kind you can hire when you have more coin than kin. They halted out of bowshot, and sent a herald, lacquered, courteous, forgettable. The message was an arrangement of careful words, a territorial claim inherited from a forgotten grant, a request to inspect the basin's governance, a promise that compliance now would prevent inconvenience later. The crown heard it all, nodded once, and said only, "Lareth is not a hallway you pass through on your way to someone else's room." The herald wrote this down, as if it could be exchanged for something later, mounted, and withdrew. Inside the walls, life measured itself against the moment. Bakers cut dough. Children traced the twin suns on dusty stones with their heels. The mill wheel turned, though the water beneath it seemed to think twice at every paddle. On the river, a ferryman slowed his stroke and watched the western ridge until his pole bumped a piling, and he cursed, and he smiled, and he did not look again. Before noon, the second report came. The mountain road had slipped, not a gesture this time, a fall. 2 spans of the path slid away like a tablecloth, whipped from under dishes. A wagon went with it, then a horse, then part of the earth that had once called itself road. The men on the repair team stood if they could, crawled if they had to, counted themselves, and found the count short. Rock dust hung in the air like unspoken words. The runner who carried this news to the city vomited in the gatehouse, and said he was sorry, as if apology could mend geography. The council convened, the board filled with weights. The steward's hands were precise, but his sleeves were rolled higher than usual. News makes heat. Messages crossed the room. "We will not be the first to lose an arrow," the crown said. The captain nodded. "We will tie the gates and widen the eyes." The healer asked for more carts and clean cloth. The miller requested men for the sluice. The scribe sharpened 3 quills and placed them like little spears in their stand. Everyone knew their work. Knowing did not slow time. The mercenaries did not attack. They did something worse for the nerves. They waited. They set up tents with the efficiency of people who have sheltered in many fields. They lit small smokeless fires. They laughed occasionally, but not cruelly. They looked like weather that had decided to wear boots. By evening, more riders had joined them. Not enough to be an overwhelming force, enough to make the wall feel thin. At dusk the bell hesitated again, that half-struck note, and then came the sound no one wanted to hear. The single flat clack of a gate chain pulled one link too far. The eastern gate, where the road sloped toward the orchards, had swollen in its frame. Timber, honest and strong all summer, swelled now with an unseasonable damp that came from nowhere anyone could point to. The hinges complained. A pin bent. A hinge pin is a small thing until it is not. Carpenters ran with tools that looked insufficient against iron's mood. Sparks fell. A child cheered, thinking of festivals. No one shushed him. It felt important that cheering still existed. Night came in, cleanly dark and complete. The watchwalks filled, Lanterns along the parapet made small islands of gold. Between them, the city breathed, but the breath was shallow. Dogs whined at doors that were never shut, this early. In the healer's room, herbs steamed in bowls that smelled like pine and church. On the river, a current rolled against the usual grain, as if the water had received a letter in a foreign language and decided to answer in kind. The first arrow found wood. It thudded into the gate plank above a guard's shoulder, as if to nail a paper there. He looked up, anger climbing his face like color. The captain's hand caught his forearm before he could draw. "Not first," the captain said, the order heavy as duty. A second arrow came and clattered on stone. No assault followed. The message was not blood, it was pressure. Then the third report, the one that bent everything. The fever in the southern wetlands turned. It did not grow murderous, it grew numerous. The healer's runners counted heads and stopped counting when counting became a way to spend the hours that should have been used for cutting bandages. Men who could lift poles yesterday, could not today. Women who could carry 2 pails, carried 1. The ferries slowed, not from fear of war, but from absence of hands. The letter the healer sent to the council was brief. "It is not a plague, but it is a tide. I can row against it, not turn it back." In the morning, the coastal city's envoy arrived with a smile that asked to be mistaken for sympathy. He carried papers thick as winter bread, stabilization accords, he called them. The levy increase was modest on the page, and catastrophic in practice. "We would not press, except for the contingencies." The Crown read every word and, when finished, closed the folder and rested both palms on it, as if it were a warm animal. "You are kind to offer umbrellas," they said, "as you untie the thatch." The envoy blinked, a man not accustomed to poetry at work. The council split the day into rooms. In one, engineering, ropes, braces, hinge pins heated and hammered back to straight, wedges for gate posts, a sketch of a new sluice like a vein drawn on a body. In another, provisioning, grain counts, oil, salted fish, cask inventory, where to put them, so that if one storehouse burned, food would not become a rumor. In another, diplomacy, letters that carried friendship, like a coin sewn into a hem. In the last, quiet and away from the others, lists of names, of the sick, of the missing, of those to be relieved from watch to sleep for 2 hours. Lists have a gravity of their own, eyes sink as they read. By afternoon, the mercenaries shifted formation, not closer, wider. They sent small groups down the lanes between fields, and stopped at every ditch, every hedge, every cottage plaque. They were mapping the valley's memory. A farmer spat into his palm and gripped his hoe as if that were a weapon. His wife put her hand on his wrist and pressed without looking. He exhaled and leaned the hoe back against the wall. The first breach was not stone, it was trust. A wagoner, pressed by cousins in a coastal counting house, opened a postern to let a messenger through with the envoy's second draft of accords. He believed, perhaps, that a door opened for paper is not a door opened for war. The watch caught the messenger, but the rumor of an open door ran faster than the fact of a caught man. Doors shut harder after that. Eyes narrowed, voices lowered when they ought to have risen and asked for help. At evening, thunder walked along the far ridge and then thought better of it. The air held its hot breath. Lanterns flared in a stray gust, guttered, and were coaxed back with cupped hands. The Crown stood again at the wall. Below, a girl with a braid, the same or another, every child is many, balanced on the lip of the fountain, and tried to teach a small dog to stay. The dog wanted to follow, no discipline for fear. The girl laughed once, clean and bright, and the laugh carried until it found someone on the parapet, who closed their eyes to keep it inside. The first gate gave at midnight, not through grand assault. The repaired hinge pin, heated and hammered true, met a knot in the old wood, and decided it had done enough. The plank sagged, the beam above it groaned with the theater of old timber, the chain dragged a note from the mechanism like a bow crossing a stubborn string. The captain swore softly, a man temporarily out-argued by physics. The watch pulled braces into place, carpenters ran, a wedge slipped, another caught. In the noise, a single arrow flew, and found a man's thigh. He sat down like a man who had remembered something important too late. The healer's boy bound it fast and said, "You'll limp." And then the man said, "Then I'll limp," and smiled at a joke too small to survive the hour. Maps do not scream when you erase a name. They sigh. The paper takes a new crease. The ink dries where it did not intend. Somewhere, a hand pauses, a heartbeat longer than usual, and then the straight edge moves on. Months after Lerith exhaled, and did not breathe back, the cartographers arrived from 3 directions, with their traveling desks and their unhurried eyes. They were not conquerors, only experts in turning land into lines. They set up tables in borrowed rooms, unrolled parchment that remembered the warmth of other countries, and asked the same careful questions. What shall we call this valley? Who claims tithe? Where do your roads go when they leave your sight? The answers came like weather. Some said the basin, as their grandparents had said, neither lie nor truth, only tide returning to shore. Some said nothing, and offered bread. Some gave 2 names, and watched to see which one the visitor would favor. A few, still loyal to the season that had made their lives briefly coherent, whispered Lerith, the way one might whisper a prayer that has become a secret. The map-makers did what map-makers do when stories diverge. They measured the ground. Distances were honest, even when men were not. From ridge to river, from ferry post to mill, from the empty platform in the square, the one that had seen a crown and later a list of names burned to ash, to the orchard where the carved staff had once leaned, numbers laid their quiet grid over a valley that had recently taught itself to be a kingdom. The grid did not find a sovereign. It found features. In the coastal capital, a clerk recopying a regional chart paused at a pale space where a label had been. The earlier draft bore the twin sigil, neatly nested beside a dotted border. The new instruction, sent with a politeness that had the pressure of stone, read, "Standardize appellations, omit unratified polities." The clerk was not cruel. He simply lifted his knife, scraped the ink to a memory, breathed on the paper to soften its fibers, and smoothed the place with a thumbnail. When he was done, the map looked clean. Cleanliness has always been one of Erasia's favorite disguises. In the Western Empire, the survey office adopted a different tactic. They renamed without saying so. The basin became a district, then a corridor, then a buffer, words that translate as something to pass through, not a place to live in. The old road, the one the crown had straightened by sending farmers with spades and song, reappeared as a military supply line. The ferry symbol at the southern wetland was copied as a tenuous dash, the cartographic equivalent of a shrug. And yet, not all omissions were bureaucratic. Some were tender. In the highlands, the carved staff was set above a hearth and darkened with smoke. When visitors asked where the treaty's partner lay, the old women told them gently that it was sleeping. In the southern villages, a healer turned the twin sin coin into a pendant for a girl who had survived the fever, an amulet against recurrence. The coin left the ledger and joined a body, a different kind of map, the kind history rarely draws, was made in stories and wrists and thresholds. There is a practice among map-makers. When land resists being pinned, they leave a gap, an open palm of paper, where lines should close. On some charts of the period, the basin is exactly that, a whiteness cupped by borders that refuse to touch. To sailors reading such a chart, the blank suggests shoals or rumor. To merchants, it suggests risk. To officials, it suggests opportunity. To the people who lived there, it suggested that the world had learned their valley only long enough to forget it properly. Even the words that survived began to slide. Lerith shifted toward epithet, a proverb in the coastal markets. Don't price your cloth in Lerith's summer, meant do not build your hopes on weather. A marching song in the western garrisons used the name as a drum syllable, a way to keep steps. In a love ballad, collected 2 provinces north, Lerith was a girl who promised to return by autumn and didn't. Language too has its maps. It keeps some borders and redraws, others without asking permission. Was this malice? Sometimes, the coastal consortium, that had tried to levy obedience into the river, signed a memorandum, instructing its factors to avoid endorsing seasonal sovereignties in documentation. Factors obeyed, paperwork forgot. But more often, it was the ordinary economy of attention. Empires prefer clean edges, and a kingdom that lived from thaw to frost, that held and prepared, and then taught its people to scatter wisely, was the opposite of a clean edge. A smudge is only interesting until the next smudge, here and there, resistant hands left stubborn marks. A monk in a cliffside scriptorium copied a pilgrimage route and drew, very small, 2 dots, like suns, where the basin widened. He did not label them. He didn't need to. A traveling poet annotated his own map with a line in the margin, where the bell rang once, like a mountain. A child, grown older, traced the river on her father's trade chart and pressed a thumbprint over the place where she had tried to teach a dog to stay. That print browned with age on the parchment, an archive of oil and insistence. Still, the official atlases, the books that tell officials what they are allowed to see, agreed. The valley was geography, not polity. The crown melted into rumor, the law into anecdote, the lighthouse into someone's borrowed lamp. Lerith became a past tense, excused from grammar, and yet, absence, like a well-cast bell, resounds. A century later, a road crew shaving the slope, where the map showed nothing but elevation, uncovered a flat stone, incised with 2 shallow circles beside a crooked crown. A mason's fragment, weather-smoothed, stubborn as a memory, that refuses to obey a diagram. The foreman set it aside without reporting, and his daughter, fond of skipping stones, tried to skim it across the creek. It sank with dignity, and stayed. Which is why, to understand what the maps would not keep, we have to leave parchment and follow hands. The diggers, the sweepers, the scholars who kneel in dust with brushes soft as moth wings. Ink erased a name. Soil kept its breath, and under that breath, in layers the color of old tea and river dusk, lie the facts that refuse to be standardized away. The first spade that struck the basin's earth, in search of Laris remains, did not belong to a historian. It was a farmer, digging a new drainage channel, after a spring flood. His shovel hit something that rang instead of thudding, a bright bell-like chime that made him stop mid-swing. He knelt, brushed the soil away with his hands, and found a curved piece of metal, the color of sunset, a coin stamped with a crown between 2 suns. The farmer slipped it into his pocket, not for money, its copper was worth less than the day's seed, but because it was beautiful, and because it felt somehow like a survivor. Word travels differently in places where history is a rumor. Within weeks, a small team from the provincial museum arrived with canvas tents and notebooks that smelled faintly of rain. They set up not far from the farmer's orchard, the hills rising like soft shoulders around them, and began to peel away the layers of earth, as though opening a letter that had been sealed for a century. The soil came away in colors, brown, ochre, pale gray, each a different season pressed into silence. In the first week, they uncovered pottery shards, some painted in geometric spirals, others plain and practical, rimmed for stacking. One fragment bore the faintest etching of a sunburst, just enough to make the lead archaeologist's hand still for a moment. Twin suns, she thought, but did not say aloud. Further down, where the soil grew cooler and smelled faintly of stone, they found the bones of walls, not tall fortifications, nothing like the vast defenses of coastal cities, but the low, sturdy foundations of a market square. Embedded in one wall was a rusted iron ring, the kind used to tie horses. Beside it lay the rotted shadow of wood that might have been a stall post. A city that no longer existed had once fastened itself here in the simplest of ways, by giving its citizens a place to tether a day's work. Archaeology is a slow conversation with the dead. You ask a question by moving a trowel. The answer comes in a pattern of brick, in the alignment of post holes, in the way a floor slopes toward a drain. In the basin, the answers emerged quietly, the remains of a stepped platform in the square, its edges worn smooth. Perhaps the coronation dais, later used for market proclamations, a fragment of carved wood, blackened by fire, but still carrying the trace of a vine pattern, clay oil lamps, their soot frozen in place like breath caught mid-sentence. The crown's presence was hinted at more than proven. Coins turned up now and then, always with the same two suns, the crown between them. Curiously, the dates, if they were dates, varied only slightly, all clustered in what we now think of as the season. There were no earlier strikes, no later issues. It was as if the mint itself had opened and closed within the same heartbeat of history. One of the most haunting finds came from a shallow pit, near what had been the eastern gate. The soil there was streaked with charcoal, suggesting fire, and within it, the team uncovered the shattered pieces of a ceramic vessel, every shard painted in a style not native to the basin. Reconstruction took months, but when the vessel was whole enough to study, it revealed a scene, a crowned figure, arms raised not in triumph, but in a gesture that could be surrender, or blessing. Around the figure, two suns, one pale and one dark, met at the horizon. Scholars argued for years whether the vessel had been made in Lerith or imported, whether it depicted history or prophecy, whether the darker sun meant eclipse or ending. No answer stuck, and yet for all the intrigue, what the ground gave most often were the traces of ordinary life. A bronze spindle whorl, worn smooth by countless turns between the fingers of a weaver, the jawbone of a goat, its teeth ground down from grazing in the uplands, a child's gaming piece, carved from bone, its edges softened by play, a section of cobblestone road, still bearing the shallow groove where cart wheels had passed so often, they'd carved their own river through the stone. To the archaeologists, these finds were not lesser than coins or artifacts of ceremony. In some ways, they mattered more. They showed that for a brief extraordinary season, Lerith was not only an idea, not only a crown or a law or a map entry, it was a place where people cooked, bargained, repaired, lost, laughed, and hoped. Every shard was a reminder that the kingdom's life was lived not in coronations, but in breakfasts and errands. Still there was an unease that crept into the camp at night. The locals, polite but watchful, sometimes visited at dusk, bringing bread or jars of plum wine, and always left before full dark. They would stand at the edges of the trench, and look down at the exposed stones, as though visiting an old wound. Some would shake their heads when asked direct questions. One elderly man, his face carved by years like the hills themselves, summed it in a single line: "The ground remembers more than we can carry." By the third season of digs, the work began to map the absence itself. Certain areas that should have held structures yielded nothing. No post holes, no midden pits, no ash layers, as if those plots had been scrubbed clean. Soil analysis suggested deliberate removal, the top layers taken away and replaced. Was it part of the kingdom's collapse, a purging of memory even as the walls still stood, or was it later, an act by those who inherited the land and wished the season of Lerith to be only rumor? One day, brushing dust from the base of a wall near the supposed northern gate, a young student found an unfinished carving. It was no bigger than a hand, a pair of circles side by side, and the faint outline of a crown above them. The lines stopped abruptly, as if the mason had been called away mid-stroke, and never returned. The stone was set low, almost hidden by the foundation, suggesting it was meant to be seen only by those who knew where to look. The archaeologists argued about whether to remove it for preservation or leave it in place as part of the gate's bones. In the end, they covered it back over. Some marks, they decided, should be left to sleep. There were no mass graves, no heaps of weapons, no layers of ash that spoke of total destruction. Instead, the soil told a quieter truth, that the people had taken themselves away. Buildings had been dismantled, not burned, their materials repurposed or carried elsewhere. Wells had been capped, not poisoned, grain pits had been emptied, not raided. It was as if the entire kingdom had folded itself, piece by piece, into other lives beyond the basin's rim. In the museum today, a small case holds the most certain things we have from that season: a coin with two suns, a spindle whorl, a lamp still faintly smelling of oil, a pottery shard with a sunburst, and a strip of vellum so fragile it rests under glass, its ink faded to the color of smoke. The vellum carries only 7 words, written in a hand scholars believe belonged to the itinerant scribe whose fragment appeared in the archives. We planted, we held, we left whole. The phrase has become a touchstone for those who study Lerith, a reminder that not all endings are ruin, and not all vanishings are failures. Some are simply choices made at the edge of the possible. From these buried voices, we turn now to the living debate they've sparked. The ground has given us fragments. The scholars have tried to weave them into whole cloth, but in that weaving, as always, the pattern changes with the teller. The ground may give us fragments, but fragments are not truth. Truth, in the hands of historians, is not a single rope. It is a braid of threads, some frayed, some dyed in colors, the others reject, some pulled from elsewhere entirely. Lerith's season has become one of those braids, and every scholar who touches it swears their hand has found the main strand. The first theory, as old as the earliest mentions in the archives, is the calamity hypothesis. It claims Lerith's rise and fall were dictated by the sky and the earth. Proponents point to the erratic river flow that the millers noted in the later weeks of the summer, to the rock slides in the mountain pass, to the unexplained damp that swelled the eastern gate timbers. They weave these details into a single meteorological disaster, a shift in weather patterns, perhaps driven by a distant volcanic eruption that disrupted harvests, weakened defenses, and broke the infrastructure just as it was being built. Supporters of this view like to quote a coastal proverb, "A crown cannot float," but those who reject the calamity hypothesis call it tidy fatalism. They raise the political constriction theory, the idea that Lerith's short life was not undone by rain or drought, but by the slow tightening of neighboring powers. The Western Empire, the coastal consortium, the Highland chiefs, each applied a kind of pressure calibrated to look like diplomacy until the moment it turned into siege. This camp sees the mercenaries on the Western Road not as opportunists, but as instruments of a calculated choke, a test run for annexation. The archival erasure, in their telling, was simply the final stitch, make the name vanish, and the valley becomes common ground again. Others push further toward intrigue with the internal fracture argument. They note that in all the archaeological finds, there are no clear markers of a singular palace or fortress for the ruler, no seat of power distinct from the market or the gate. To them this suggests that the council version of Lerith's leadership may be the truest, a loose coalition of factions united only briefly by a shared grievance. Once the initial cause, freedom from external tithe, was secured, those factions reverted to old rivalries. In this view, the collapse was less a fall and more a quiet vote of no confidence. The disease hypothesis has its own disciples, especially among medical historians. They focus on the fever in the southern wetlands, described in Healer's notes as mild but pervasive, draining enough to slow ferries and farm work. These scholars propose that the sickness spread farther than records suggest, sapping the valley's labor force at the exact moment the harvest and defenses needed it most. Without enough hands to work and fight, the kingdom simply could not hold. To bolster their case, they point to burial patterns in nearby villages, a cluster of graves dated to the season year, unusual for the period. Skeptics counter that the fever would have to be far deadlier to topple an entire polity, but the theory endures, especially in times when epidemics are fresh in the public mind. Then there is the mythic skepticism school, scholars who argue that Lerith never truly existed as a kingdom at all, at least not in the form romanticized today. To them the twin sun coins were commemorative tokens minted for a seasonal alliance or festival, the banners, a temporary show of unity during a trade summit. The coronation fragment, in their telling, depicts a ceremonial role, a high steward, perhaps elevated for a single year. The dramatic collapse was simply the end of the event, its traces magnified by later storytellers, hungry for a parable about impermanence. For this group, Lerith is less history than metaphor, a lesson that survived precisely because it could be shaped to fit any moment. The fiercest debates happen in the narrow corridor between two rival camps, the deliberate dispersalists and the overwhelmed fatalists. The deliberate dispersalists hold that Lerith's leadership, seeing the storm coming, chose to dismantle the kingdom intentionally, scattering its assets, its people, even its records, to prevent conquest. They point to the capped wells, the dismantled buildings, the absence of battlefield remains as evidence of an orderly withdrawal rather than a chaotic rout. In this reading, Lerith didn't fall, it folded itself neatly into the pockets of its neighbors, ensuring that nothing of value could be seized intact. The overwhelmed fatalists scoff at this. To them the same evidence speaks of abandonment born from exhaustion, capped wells, useless when the river's channel changes, empty granaries, cleared out by necessity, not strategy, missing bodies, taken by flight, not foresight. They argue that kingdoms rarely have the luxury to choose their manner of ending, but the human instinct to survive will scatter a people without any need for royal direction. The neatness deliberate dispersalists admire, say the fatalists, is just hindsight polishing chaos. Beneath all of these is an undercurrent. Few speak openly about the Erosia conspiracy. This theory lives more in taverns than in journals, though it occasionally surfaces in fringe conferences. It suggests that the deliberate removal of Lerith from maps, the standardized avoidance of its name in documents, was part of a coordinated effort by multiple powers to destroy not just the kingdom, but the idea of it. In this view, the very brevity of Lerith's life made it dangerous, proof that a small leader-light cooperative polity could thrive if left alone. Better then to make it an unstory, a blank, a season no one remembers except as a cautionary ghost. Even among the conspiracy-minded, there's disagreement over the why behind the Erosia. Some point to economic motives, Lerith's low tariffs undercutting established trade monopolies. Others claim it was religious, the absence of a temple hierarchy making it suspect in the eyes of faith-bound states. A few go further into the shadows, muttering about the twin suns as an esoteric emblem, feared by those who saw in it a code, a calendar, a heresy. What unites all these theories is not consensus, but the stubborn magnetism of the question itself: how could a place rise so quickly, shine so brightly, and disappear so cleanly? Why does every scrap of evidence feel both conclusive and evasive? In archives and excavation sites, in academic halls and roadside inns, Lerith's season is an argument that never ends, and perhaps never should. For the people of the basin, those who farm the same soil, drink from the same rivers, and pass the same unmarked stones, the dispute is more intimate. Some refuse to speak of Lerith at all, wary of inviting whatever fate took it. Others claim it with quiet pride, as if their ancestry has borrowed a little of that fleeting sovereignty. A few families keep coins or pottery fragments in boxes, bringing them out not for display but for reassurance, proof that the season was real, and that it left more than silence. In the museum, the vellum strip with its 7 words, "We planted, we held, we left whole," is visited by both camps. The deliberate dispersalists nod at it, as confirmation of their thesis. The overwhelmed fatalists see only a poetic face laid over retreat. School children stare at it, without knowing they're inheriting an argument. Lovers stand before it, and say nothing at all, perhaps sensing that some endings don't belong to scholarship, but to the privacy of those who lived them. Every theory, from the most clinical to the most romantic, has one thing in common: it ends with a pause, a gap where the teller admits aloud, or in their own mind, that they do not know. Not entirely. That they are standing in the shadow of a crown, worn only for a season, trying to read its shape from the way light falls on the ground. And it is in that pause, in that humility, that we find the next thread, not in walls or wells, but in the single figure at the center of every telling, the one whose name, face and final hour remain the most disputed truth of all. There is a point, in every telling of Lerith, when the maps, the ledgers, the sluices, and hinge pins fall quiet. and a single question begins to speak in their place. Where did the ruler go? The records grow personal here. Ink acquires a pulse. Scribes write not as officers, but as witnesses, or as people who knew a witness, or as people who loved someone who swore they had once stood close enough to see the crown catch the last of the light. 3 endings recur like refrains, and each has its own cadence. The first ending is Exile by Water. It begins in grey dawn, with a cloak thrown over ordinary clothes, and the crown left not on a cushion, but in a drawer lined with linen. The ruler descends alone to the river, where the ferryman, the same who joked about being a courtier with a pole, is waiting, jaw tight, eyes wet in a way only river air can explain. No retinue, no chest, only a wrapped parcel, small enough to fit beneath a bench. They push off, the current takes them, the pole taps the bed, the boat moves like a sentence that has decided not to end. At the southern braid, where the water widens and weeds thicken, the ferryman lifts his pole and whispers a blessing he had never said aloud. The ruler nods once, not like a king, like a person who understands what it costs to remain. The boat slips into reeds and fog, and when the fog lifts, it is simply not there, as if the river had remembered the trick it taught itself when it changed channels and applied it to a human life. Evidence, a pole found later, with a ribbon of vegetable blue caught in a notch, a ledger note in the ferryman's hand written and then struck through. Special crossing. No fee. A rumor that far downstream a village took in a stranger who knew how to count the sky and mend a hinge in the same afternoon. The exile version comforts people who favor mercy, that a life could continue modest and unmarked, like a candle moved into another room. The second ending is assassination at the wall. It keeps the city in frame, refuses the romantic fog. In this telling, the ruler refuses dispersal. Not yet, they say, and mount the steps. The lamplight trembles along the parapet. The stone is warm from the bell's old voice, as if to keep company. A shadow separates from a darker shadow near the stairs. Turn, not enemy, not friend, just a hand paid to turn history into a single gesture. The dagger finds the place between ribs that even armor used to envy. If the archives are the bones of history, then songs and stories are its breath. And in the basin where Lareth once stood, that breath still moves. Sometimes in the open air of festivals, sometimes behind closed doors, where the telling is quieter, meant for the ears of children or the comfort of old age. In the villages along the river, there is a winter song, sung in a slow, swaying rhythm. The melody climbs like a lantern, rising, and falls like a ferry, settling against its dock. Its words, never written down, tell of 2 suns that met and parted before the snow could fall twice. Some verses speak of a crown that turned to copper in the rain, others, of a ruler who planted wheat by hand and vanished before the harvest. Each singer alters the details, but the refrain always returns to a single line. We held for a season, and the season held us. It is less a lament than a lull, a reminder that even brief warmth is still warmth. In the highlands, the memory takes another shape, not a song, but a dance. On the summer solstice, at the height of the day, 2 circles of dancers form, one moving clockwise, the other against it. In the center, a child holds a wooden crown, painted gold on one side and silver on the other. At the turning point, the dancers swap directions, and the crown is flipped. No one calls it the dance of Lareth, but in the murmurs afterward, the old people sometimes do. They say it is older than the fall, older even than the rise, but it feels like an echo of that single season when opposites moved together before parting. The southern wetlands keep their own remembrance in the form of a riddle game. A leader chants, "What has no shadow in summer but sleeps in the frost?" The children answer with guesses, the eel, the rain barrel, the blackbird's nest, until someone says, "The crown." At that, the leader nods and adds a second line, "What is heavier than stone, but carried by air?" The answer, whispered like a spell, is a vow. The game continues until the leader runs out of questions or the children run out of patience. Outsiders often think it nonsense. Locals know it's the way the youngest learn the story, without having to sit through the politics of it. There are tales told beside fires in the uplands that place the vanished ruler in disguise. In one, they work as a shepherd, guiding flocks with the same patience they once used on councils. In another, they are a baker in a border town, their loaves stamped with a sun on each end, a code only the old traders still notice. In a third, they live in the high forest, weaving cloth that changes color with the weather, selling it only to those who can name both suns without hesitation. The truth is irrelevant, the telling is the point. Merchants, too, have their stories. Bargemen on long routes tell of nights when the fog settles low and a small craft appears beside them. No oars, no wake, just a figure standing at the stern. The figure offers a single copper coin with 2 suns and asks for bread, never wine, never salt. If given, they nod once and vanish into the fog. If refused, the bargeman's next cargo will be spoiled by mold, mice, or ill chance. It is said the wise keep a loaf and a coin ready at all times, in case the king is hungry. In the coastal cities, where memory is often sharpened into warning, the name Lerith survives in proverbs. Don't build in Lerith summer, advice against trusting sudden fortune. Or, less harsh, remember Lerith's lamp, a phrase used when someone safeguards a small fragile hope. Traders have been known to draw 2 tiny circles in chalk on the doors of storerooms, believing it wards off sudden collapse. No one claims to believe in the superstition, but the circles appear anew every few years. What binds all these versions is their refusal to die. Even when not named outright, Lerith's season hums under the surface of games, dances, sayings, and melodies. Children who have never seen a coin with 2 suns can still hum the winter song's refrain. Farmers, who have never read an archive, can still answer the riddle about the crown. It is a kind of resistance, not the defiance of armies, but the quiet refusal to let a thing vanish entirely. And sometimes the memory rises in places no one expects. A traveler in a distant market might hear a tune from the basin and find themselves singing the next line without knowing why. A basket weaver in a northern port might tie her reeds in a pattern of twin loops for luck, she says, though her grandmother told her it was for the season. A scholar cataloguing folk songs may notice that the ones from the basin often end midline, as if leaving space for something not sung. In the museum, visitors sometimes leave small offerings at the glass case that holds the vellum strip, the coin, and the spindle whorl, a sprig of dried grass, a folded note, once a child's ribbon dyed vegetable blue and river green. No label asks them to do this. The habit is unorganized, unrecorded, and perhaps that is why it continues. Folklore does what archives cannot. It allows contradiction. In song, the ruler can be both shepherd and baker, crowned and vanished, betrayed and wise. In story, the season can be glorious and doomed, merciful and fragile. Memory, when it belongs to everyone, does not need to resolve into one truth. It only needs to live. From here, the melody carries forward into the present day, where Lerith's absence has become a shape modern eyes and hands still try to trace. The map is blank, but the echoes keep finding new rooms to inhabit. History does not stay still. Even the stories that seem to belong to another age keep walking, changing their clothes to match the century. Lerith's single season has done this better than most. Its crown and coins are long gone from hands, its name long gone from the maps, yet its silhouette still moves through the modern world, sometimes boldly, more often in quiet corners, where only certain eyes notice. In the coastal capital, there is a cafe that has stood for over 100 years on a narrow street near the harbor. Its sign is 2 interlocked circles, gold on black, with no words. The owner will tell you, it's just an old trade symbol for partnership. But if you lean on the counter long enough, you might hear a different story, that the circles are the twin sons of Lerith, and the cafe is built on the site of an old counting house that once traded with the basin during its single summer of independence. Whether true or not, locals refer to it simply as the season, and regulars know that the two best tables are called the Crown and the Gate. In the Highland towns, the treaty staff, carved during Lerith's brief sovereignty, still appears in processions, but now it is carried by schoolchildren during a yearly festival, meant to honor the valley's spirit. Official speeches avoid the name, focusing instead on themes of unity, cooperation, and resilience. But the older spectators smile in a way that suggests they are hearing a second speech, layered beneath the first. The arts, too, have adopted Lerith as a symbol, often without saying so. A series of oil paintings, exhibited last decade, depicted a nameless walled city in the height of summer, each canvas showing a different moment of light, passing over its stones. No people appear, yet the composition is such that you expect someone to walk into the frame. Critics spoke of the melancholy of unoccupied spaces and the tension between glory and abandonment. The painter, when asked about her inspiration, said only, "I was thinking about things that last just long enough to be missed." In literature, the season kingdom has become shorthand for any fleeting success, whether in politics, business, or love. Novelists set their stories in thinly disguised valleys, where the crops are perfect, and the roads are new, and the reader understands from the first chapter that all of it will be gone by the last. A handful of academic works in political theory use Lerith openly, turning it into a case study on the vulnerabilities of small polities, though each admits, in a final footnote, that the historical record is incomplete enough to make any conclusion provisional. Commerce has found ways to wear the twin suns as fashion. A jewelry company sells a pendant of two circles joined by a crown-shaped clasp. Officially, it is called the Eclipse. A craft brewery in the Western Empire offers a seasonal ale with two stylized suns on the label and a tagline that reads, "One batch only, drink before the frost." In both cases, marketing copy avoids mentioning Lerith, but those who know the story recognize the reference instantly. Even politics, which prefers lessons it can measure, has drawn from the memory. Activists in rural provinces have invoked the season when arguing for local autonomy, citing it as proof that communities can self-govern without decades of build-up, though opponents reply with equal ease that its brevity proves the opposite. The phrase "don't tax the harvest before it grows," remember the season, has been spotted on handmade placards at demonstrations, its meaning as open to interpretation now as it was in the archives. And then there is the internet, that vast modern marketplace of rumor, nostalgia, and invention. In certain corners of online forums, the name Lerith is used as a kind of tag for stories about places that existed briefly and then were erased, whether they are towns swallowed by reservoirs, pop-up art districts closed by redevelopment, or even short-lived friendships. Users post images of half-demolished buildings, abandoned festivals, or broken signs, and caption them simply, "Another Lerith." The word has become a code for fleeting beauty and the ache it leaves behind. Tourism boards have learned to capitalize on this quiet cult. The basin itself, still fertile, still beautiful, still ringed by those protective hills, now advertises the Season Trail, a walking route that passes the known archaeological sites and the museum's modest collection. The official brochures speak of ancient market squares and mystery coins, but the guides who lead the tours sometimes let slip the stories they grew up with: the crown on the wall at dawn, the bell that rang once like a mountain, the ruler who may or may not still walk in disguise. In one small riverside inn, a guest book contains messages in dozens of languages, many of them thanking the staff for keeping the lamp lit. No lamp is mentioned in the inn's advertising, but in the back storeroom there is a glass-shaded oil lamp wrapped in cloth. The owner says it came with the building and has never gone out in his tenure, though he admits he trims the wick and refills the oil every month. He will not say where the lamp came from before that. Schools in the region still teach the map with the basin as blank space, an oddity in an age obsessed with filling every gap with a label. Teachers encourage students to imagine what might go there, some draw castles, some draw farms. One year, a child drew only a bell, very large, filling the entire valley. Asked why, she said, "So they'll know we were here, even if they don't know who we were." The modern echoes are not always reverent. Satirists have used Lerith as a metaphor for overhyped ventures that collapse after a season, a television show cancelled after 4 episodes, a political campaign that burns bright and burns out, a product launch that disappears by the next fiscal quarter. Yet even in mockery, the tone is often tinged with affection. It is hard to sneer entirely at something that had the audacity to appear fully formed and then bow out before it could be diminished. Meanwhile, the museum's twin sun coin, the most famous surviving artifact, has been digitally scanned, printed on t-shirts, made into wallpapers, and adapted into emoji by those who have no interest in archaeological provenance but love the clean symmetry of its design. That coin's image has traveled further than the coin itself ever could, turning Lerith's emblem into a kind of quiet brand for impermanence. Perhaps the most telling echo is the way the valley's residents still use time. Ask someone when they last saw a friend, or when the orchards were at their best, and they might say, 2 summers before the season, or in the year of the season's rain. They are not marking years on a standard calendar. They are fixing them to an event the official world has decided not to name. In this way, Lerith still orders the days, still sets the boundaries for before and after. The kingdom may have existed for only 1 season, but in the modern world its after-image is longer than any reign could hope to be. It appears in gold on black above a cafe door, in the spin of a brewery label, in a riddle whispered to children, in an activist's slogan, in a pendant resting on a stranger's chest, in a city that has never seen the basin's hills. These echoes remind us that absence is not the same as forgetting. Sometimes the things erased from the page are the ones we learn to carry in other forms, in jewelry, in dances, in maps left blank, in the private vocabulary of those who know. From here the present hands the story back to the past, and we step into the quiet work of summing a season's worth of rise and fall. The lights are dimmed, the crown is gone, and what remains is the lesson. A kingdom that lasts for only 1 season is an argument, not just a story. It asks, what is power for? What is worth building, if you know it will not last? And perhaps, most uncomfortably, when is it wiser to let go than to hold? The chroniclers who write about Lerith tend to focus on the fragility, the river that shifted, the fever that drained the hands, the neighboring powers that pressed in. But the people who lived in the basin, and those who still inherit its soil, remember the other side, the warmth of a market square, where no tax collector from a distant capital came to count the coin, the safety of a night without the sound of hooves in the dark, the pride of a flag that was theirs, even if it flew for only a handful of moons. From these 2 views, the first lesson emerges. Value is not measured only in duration. The world's great empires leave stone and marble. Their shadows stretch across centuries. Lerith left copper coins, spindle whorls, soot in clay lamps, and the kind of memory that becomes a compass pointing to what is possible, even for a short time. The basin's farmers still speak of season gains, meaning a harvest so good it could be taken away tomorrow and still be worth having. In their logic, Lerith's season was that harvest. The second lesson is more complicated. Strength is not the same as permanence. Lerith was strong in its summer, its roads mended, its gates tied, its markets fair. But permanence requires more than strength. It demands roots that can drink from deep waters when the river changes course, alliances that can hold when weather and rumor turn. Perhaps the kingdom could have built those roots, given years. Perhaps the season was all the time it ever had. The lesson is not to scorn what is fleeting, but to understand that no amount of vigor in the present can guarantee the future if the ground beneath is shifting. A third lesson hides in the way Lerith ended. There is dignity in dispersal. Most kingdoms end in fire, or in the hollow echo of surrender. Lerith's artifacts tell a quieter story: capped wells, dismantled structures, resources carried away rather than left to be plundered. This is not defeat in the usual sense, it is a choice to dissolve rather than be taken. The vellum strip in the museum, "We planted, we held, we left whole," may be the clearest statement of this philosophy. It speaks to a kind of leadership that sees survival not in walls, but in what the people can carry with them. Then there is the lesson of the blank space on the map. The cartographers erased Lareth with a knife and a steady hand. They called it standardization, tidying the lines, removing unratified names. But the blank remains. For modern historians, the absence is as instructive as the presence would have been. It warns that power can vanish not only through conquest, but through the subtler violence of omission. The space where Lareth should be is now a reminder: what is unrecorded can be forgotten, and what is forgotten can be repeated, for good or ill. Yet perhaps the most enduring lesson is the one whispered through the songs and games that survived. Memory belongs to the people, not the record. A crown can be melted, a border redrawn, a name struck from the archive, but a winter song about two suns meeting and parting, a riddle about a vow heavier than stone, a dance that changes direction at its peak, these slip past the reach of official erasure. They teach that when a thing is worth keeping, it must be woven into life, not just written into law. This lesson holds a mirror to the modern echoes: the cafe sign, with two interlocked circles, the brewery's one batch ale, the activist's placard. These are not just curiosities. They are evidence of an instinct older than history. When something matters, we find new containers for it. If the archive won't keep it, we pour it into songs, symbols, habits, and names that seem innocent until you know where to look. There is also a caution in Lareth's season, one that makes the basin's elders pause before speaking of it to outsiders. Hope is not harmless. Hope brought Lareth into being. The hope that a basin long divided could unite, that tariffs could be fair, that neighbors could be persuaded by good faith. That hope was not wasted, but it came at a cost. When the season ended, those who had given themselves fully to the idea of Lareth felt the loss as a kind of betrayal, even if no one had lied to them. The elders know that the next time someone promises a crown, the memory of that ache will rise alongside the memory of the summer's safety, and yet, they will tell you quietly, perhaps only when the lamps are low, that it was worth it, worth the work of mending roads, worth the joy of market days under new banners, worth the sound of the great bell's single, mountain-like note. Even if it was always destined to end, those months redefined what the basin thought possible. In that way, Lareth's most important legacy may be not the memory of what it was, but the memory of what it allowed its people to imagine. Historians, of course, approach these lessons with the caution of their trade. They point out that we cannot be certain of every detail, that some of the most vivid stories may be later inventions, that the archaeological record is too thin to prove deliberate strategy in the dispersal. They are right to be careful, but even they admit that Lareth's brevity has made it paradoxically larger in the mind than many kingdoms that lasted centuries. In the imagination, it occupies the space between history and parable, and in that space it keeps teaching. Perhaps the simplest lesson is the one that fits in the mouth like a proverb: a season is still a life. In the language of the basin, there is a word that means both summer and fullness. When they speak of Lareth, they use that word, not as an epitaph, but as a description. Fullness does not ask how long it will last. It asks only whether it is complete in itself. So what do we do with the story of a fleeting crown? We remember that power can be chosen for service rather than hoarded for endurance. We remember that endings can be acts of preservation, as much as beginnings are acts of creation. We remember that even a brief, bright alignment of people, of purpose, of place, can change the course of lives. And we remember that when the crown is gone, and the banners are folded, the real work is done in the quieter hours, in carrying forward what was good, in warning against what was fragile, and in keeping alive the memory of how it felt to stand in the square, on a day when the river ran smooth, the gates stood open, and the season belonged entirely to those who lived in it. From here the reflections settle into stillness, and the story loops back to where it began, to the turning of the seasons, to the quiet of a kingdom after its single summer, to the way the land remembers even when the lines on the map do not. In the basin, Mornings return to their ordinary length. The river keeps its counsel, neither boastful with flood nor stingy with drought. The fields dress themselves in the modest colors of work. What was once a square is only a widening of the road where wagons prefer to pause. You could walk here and never suspect that a season once changed the weight of the air. But if you stop, just for a breath, just long enough for silence to take its first step, the place begins to speak in the quiet grammar of after. A line of stones that refuses to align with the modern fence. A dip in the path where feet remembered a different pace. Two circles smoothed into the gatepost by fingers that ran out of reasons to keep polishing. The kingdom that lasted a single season did not vanish into nothing, it diluted into everything. The coin, with two suns, is a pendant, now. The lamp, a habit of care, the treaty staff, a procession stick in the hands of children, who lift it, as if it were not heavy at all. The crown is an outline in a drawer somewhere, pressed into linen, like a leaf. There is comfort in this. Not triumph. Comfort, the kind that lets the shoulders settle and the breath ease. Lareth was not a contest with time. It was a conversation. For one summer, the valley replied to a question the world had long stopped asking it. What would you be, if left briefly to your own best self? The answer came in roads mended and gates tied, prices made fair, and nights made safe. The answer faded, as answers do. The question remains, and that is enough to turn towards sleep without fear of forgetting. The elders say the year has 4 voices, and each teaches something different. Winter speaks of patience, spring speaks of courage, summer speaks of fullness, autumn speaks of release. Lareth learned all 4 in one breath. It waited through winters of being ignored, stepped forward in a spring of audacity, filled itself in a summer of order and laughter, and then, when the river, the road and the rumor asked too much, it practiced the tenderness of letting go. There is a way of standing at the river's edge that makes this clear. You watch the surface slip past, and choose not to name it loss, you call it motion. You understand that the boat carrying the last of the season's letters, or the ferryman's blessing, or the ruler's quiet departure, moves in the same physics as every child's toy bark and every trader's barge. Water is not a verdict, it is a path. And so, when the bell is mentioned, that single note described as like a mountain, imagine not the alarm, but the echo. Bronze lifts its voice, stone keeps it, air carries it into distances where names have already thinned. The sound becomes memory, not by clinging, but by traveling. You can still hear it, if you stop walking, and let the hill listen for you. In the archives, a clerk closes a book and leaves a small, unsanctioned slip in the binding, 2 penciled circles, a crooked crown. In the museum, someone wipes the glass and finds beneath their cloth a tiny fingerprint. A child left it the day she pressed her nose against the case. In the highlands, smoke lays a new layer on the treaty staff, and the room smells like wool and rain. In the coastal cafe, the 2 golden circles glow above the door as evening gathers, and a stranger who has never heard the story chooses the table called the gate, without knowing why. The world does not need to agree on what happened. The world rarely does. What matters is how gently a people learn to carry a short, bright thing, without bitterness, without grandeur, with the kind of dignity that shows up most clearly in small acts, the last loaf given freely, the hinge oiled on a door that may never open again, the list of names burned so no one else can use it for harm, the lamp tended though no decree compels it. If you came here seeking certainty, you will leave with something softer and perhaps more durable. Not a final answer, but a way to stand within the unanswered without hardening. Lareth teaches that a season can be complete even if it is brief, that a vow can end without breaking, that a map can leave a space unlabeled and still be true to the land. That power, when it has remembered its purpose, can step down without drama and still be called noble. Listen, a last time, to the phrases that have become our hush. We planted, we held, we left whole. The sentence fits in the mouth like bread, it is enough. And now the story returns to its opening light, the small thaw, the first bird stitching sound across the morning, the hill's long shadow, reluctant to move, and then inevitably moving. Somewhere, a child flips a wooden crown from gold to silver in a festival dance. Somewhere, a healer ties up herbs and says they'll be needed less this year, she hopes. Somewhere, a road crew finds a smooth stone with two faint circles and decides, without meeting one another's eyes, to set it under the corner of a culvert where it can keep doing useful work. The season turns again, not back, not away, simply onward. That is the mercy of time. It refuses to stop at either victory or loss. It keeps laying down new days until the old ones arrange themselves into meaning. If you pass through the basin, you might not see a kingdom. You might only see orchards, and a river where lamps make coins of the water at dusk, and a dog not very good at staying. But if you pause, in the widening of the road, at the gatepost with its smooth circles, at the ferry where the pole still taps the bed like a heartbeat, the air will feel slightly thicker with what was once believed here, and what, in certain weather, is believed still. Close your eyes, let the map go blank where it insists on labels, let the bell's single note lengthen in your chest until it is not a warning but a benediction. Let the twin suns rise and set, on whatever you are building that may not endure and is still worth the work. The kingdom that existed for only one season has finished speaking. The land keeps the rest, night gathers its shawl, the river moves. Somewhere, far or near, a lamp is trimmed, a coin is turned between fingers for luck, a promise is made with the modest courage the basin taught. Sleep now. When you wake, the world will be turning, as it always has, and the season will be waiting to begin again, not as a replica, but as a rhythm. And that is enough.